Hello and welcome to this new video. Before we begin, please let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I love seeing how these stories reach people all around the world. The evolution of writing, from stone to screen. Writing didn't begin with words. It began with marks, deliberate, meaningful marks that our ancestors made to say, "I was here, and this matters." This is the story of how those marks evolved into the complex writing systems we use today, told chronologically from the oldest evidence we have to the screens we type on now. 30,000 BCE, cave paintings, the first marks. The oldest evidence of humans making meaningful marks dates back over 30,000 years. In caves across Europe, Africa, and Asia, our ancestors ground ochre into powder, mixed it with animal fat, and painted on stone walls. They made charcoal from burned wood and used it to draw. This wasn't writing as we know it, but it was the first time humans made marks that carried meaning beyond the immediate moment. The process of creating these pigments was remarkably sophisticated and laborious. Red ochre, the most common pigment, had to be located first. These iron oxide deposits weren't found everywhere. Sometimes communities traveled dozens of miles to reach ochre sources. Archaeological evidence shows that certain ochre mines were used continuously for thousands of years, suggesting these locations held cultural significance. Once obtained, the ochre lumps had to be processed. They were ground on flat stones using round grinding stones, reducing the chunks to fine powder. The finer the powder, the smoother the paint would be. This grinding could take hours for a single batch of pigment. The powder was then mixed with a binder, usually animal fat rendered from hunted game, though sometimes plant oils or egg whites were used in different regions and periods. The fat served multiple purposes. It made the powder spreadable, helped it adhere to the stone surface, and protected the pigment from moisture. Some cave paintings show evidence of additives, crushed bone or shell that changed the texture or color slightly. The knowledge of which additives worked, in what proportions, represented accumulated wisdom passed down through generations. Black pigment came from charcoal, but not just any charcoal. Different woods produce different blacks, some darker, some with different textures when ground. Creating good charcoal required controlled burning, usually in pits covered with earth to limit oxygen. The partially burned wood was then ground to powder and mixed with the same binders as ochre. White pigment, used less frequently but present in many caves, came from chalk or kaolin clay. Yellow came from yellow ochre or from mixing red ochre with white. The palette was limited but sophisticated. Different shades could be achieved by varying the ratios of pigments, the fineness of grinding, and the thickness of application. The canvas was the cave wall itself, usually limestone. But not just any wall section. Artists chose their surfaces carefully. Smooth, relatively flat areas were preferred, though some paintings deliberately used the cave's natural contours to create three-dimensional effects. A bulge in the wall might become a bison's shoulder. A crack might suggest a spear's trajectory. Some cave walls were prepared before painting. Evidence suggests scraping or smoothing of surfaces, perhaps even washing them with water. In some cases, a thin layer of clay or limestone paste was applied first, creating an even surface for detailed work. This preparation shows intentionality. These weren't spontaneous scribbles, but carefully planned creations. The pen varied by technique. For broad strokes and filling large areas, fingers were probably used, smearing the pigment paste directly onto stone. For fine lines and details, sticks with frayed or carved tips served as brushes. Some evidence suggests primitive brushes made by tying animal hair or plant fibers to sticks. Hollow bones, usually bird bones, served another purpose: blow tubes for creating spray effects. Pigment powder was placed in the mouth and blown through the bone tube at the wall. This technique created diffuse, cloudy effects and was used particularly for hand stencils. The artist would place their hand against the wall and blow pigment around it, leaving a negative image, the hand's outline preserved in the surrounding pigment. Some caves show evidence of scaffolding or ladders. Paintings high on walls or on ceilings required elevated platforms. Post holes or ledges cut into walls suggest wooden structures once stood there. This implies organized effort, not solitary artists, but communities working together, building infrastructure to create these images. The paintings have survived for millennia because of the unique cave environment. Caves maintain relatively constant temperature year-round, avoiding the expansion and contraction that damages surface materials. Humidity is stable. No direct sunlight penetrates to fade pigments. No wind erodes surfaces. The calcium carbonate in limestone walls sometimes formed a thin mineral layer over paintings, effectively sealing them beneath a protective coating. Some caves were sealed by rockfalls or deliberately closed by ancient peoples, creating perfect time capsules. When modern explorers rediscovered these caves, like Lascaux in 1940, they found paintings so vivid they appeared recently made, not 17,000 years old. What did they write? Not words, but a rich symbolic language of images. Bison, horses, deer, mammoths, rhinoceros, cave lions, the animals they hunted and feared, appear in stunning detail. The famous caves of Lascaux in France contain over 600 paintings and 1,500 engravings showing hunting scenes with remarkable anatomical accuracy. Artists understood animal movement, muscle structure, proportions. Chauvet Cave, discovered in 1994, depicts over a dozen species, including many predators rarely shown elsewhere: cave lions, panthers, bears, hyenas. The artists used shading techniques, multiple overlapping images to suggest movement, and sophisticated perspective. Some animals are shown in groups that suggest observation of actual herd behavior. Human figures appear, but are rarer and often more abstract than animal depictions. The Lascaux bird-headed man shows a stick-figure human fallen beneath a wounded bison, perhaps a hunting accident or a mythological scene. Hand stencils appear in caves worldwide, in Sulawesi, Indonesia, in Patagonia, in Europe. Over 450 handprints exist in the Cave of Hands in Argentina. Geometric symbols appear frequently: dots, lines, grids, ladders, crosses. Their meaning remains mysterious. Some researchers suggest they're abstract concepts or possibly proto-writing symbols. Certain symbols recur across vast distances and time periods, hinting at either cultural transmission or perhaps something deeper. Symbols emerging from human neurology itself. Shared visual language arising from how our brains process information. Why did they paint? we can only theorize. Hunting magic seems likely for some. Painting an animal might help ensure a successful hunt. The locations of paintings support this. Many are in deep cave recesses, difficult to reach, suggesting ritual significance rather than everyday viewing. Some caves show evidence of acoustic properties, specific locations where sounds echo dramatically, suggesting ceremonial use. Teaching might be another purpose, showing young hunters the appearance and behavior of prey animals, passing down knowledge of animal anatomy and movement. Some paintings show wounds in specific locations, vital areas for killing prey, possibly instructional diagrams. Social bonding and identity could drive cave painting. Creating these images together, returning to add new paintings over generations, could reinforce community ties and cultural continuity. Some caves show evidence of use over thousands of years, with multiple layers of painting, suggesting these were sacred spaces returned to generation after generation. One fascinating discovery emerged from studying symbol distribution. Certain abstract signs appear in caves across Europe, suggesting either long-distance cultural contact or possibly very early forms of notation. The claviform sign, a club or P-shaped symbol, appears in caves from Spain to France. Dots arranged in specific patterns recur. If these carried consistent meanings across regions, they represent the earliest step toward true writing. Abstract symbols standing for concepts rather than just representing visual reality. 3,500 to 3,200 BCE. Mesopotamian clay tablets. True writing emerges. The first true writing system emerged in ancient Sumer in what is now southern Iraq, around 3,500 to 3,200 BCE. This was proto-cuneiform, evolving from a system of clay tokens into actual writing that could capture spoken language. The material was wet clay, abundant along the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. The rivers annually flooded, depositing rich silt that was perfect for pottery and writing. Scribes would dig clay from riverbanks or designated clay pits, selecting clay with the right consistency, not too sandy, not too heavy. The clay was transported back to the scribal workspace in baskets or clay jars. Preparing the clay required skill and experience. The raw clay contained debris, small stones, plant matter, air bubbles that had to be removed. Scribes kneaded the clay repeatedly, much like kneading bread dough, working out air pockets that could cause tablets to crack when drying or firing. Water was added gradually to achieve the perfect consistency. Too wet and the clay would stick to tools and deform when handled. Too dry and it would crumble or not take clear impressions. Once properly prepared, the clay was formed into tablets. The size varied by purpose. Small tags for identifying goods might be only a few inches across. Administrative records used palm-sized tablets. Major literary works or royal inscriptions required larger tablets, sometimes as big as modern hardcover books. The scribe would pinch off a portion of clay, roll it into a ball, then flatten it between the hands or against a flat surface to create the tablet shape. The edges were smoothed, the surface made as flat as possible. Some scribes used a flat piece of wood or stone to ensure an even writing surface. The tablet had to be neither too thick, wasting clay and making it heavy, nor too thin, risking breakage. Standard sizes emerged for different document types, showing bureaucratic standardization appearing alongside writing itself. The pen was a reed stylus, carefully crafted from reeds growing in marshes throughout Mesopotamia. Not just any reed would do. Certain species had the right combination of rigidity and slight flexibility. The reed was cut to a comfortable length, usually about the length of a hand, and the tip was cut at an angle to create a triangular edge. This wedge-shaped tip is fundamental to cuneiform's appearance. Scribes maintained multiple style with different tip widths. Fine tips for small, detailed signs, broader tips for larger inscriptions. A scribe's stylus kit was a prized possession, often carefully stored in a leather pouch or wooden case. The style needed regular maintenance. The tips wore down with use and had to be recut. A skilled scribe could tell from the feel whether the stylus tip was still sharp enough for clean impressions. The writing technique required practice and precision. The stylus was held at an angle and pressed into the soft clay, creating wedge-shaped impressions. The scribe didn't draw lines as we might with a pen. Instead, each cuneiform sign was built from multiple wedge impressions pressed at different angles. A single character might require 5 or 10 separate stylus presses. The scribe worked quickly but carefully. Clay dries, especially in the hot Mesopotamian climate. A tablet might remain workable for only 15 or 20 minutes before the surface became too hard for clear impressions. This meant the scribe had to plan the layout, know exactly what to write, and execute without hesitation. Mistakes were difficult to correct. The clay could be smoothed and reworked if caught immediately, but once it began drying, errors were permanent. For important documents, scribes sometimes made practice tablets, writing out the text on a throwaway tablet to check the layout and wording before creating the final version. This shows the value placed on official documents and the professional standards of the scribal class. Once writing was complete, the tablet could be left to dry naturally in the sun, adequate for temporary records, or fired in a kiln for permanent preservation. Firing transformed the clay chemically, turning it essentially to stone. Fired tablets became incredibly durable, resistant to water, insects, and time itself. These baked clay tablets have survived extraordinarily well. Unlike organic materials that rot, clay improves with firing. Today, museums worldwide hold over 130,000 cuneiform tablets, and new discoveries occur regularly. Some tablets sat buried for 5,000 years and emerged perfectly readable, their wedge marks as crisp as the day they were made. The survival rate for clay tablets far exceeds any other ancient writing medium. Entire libraries have been recovered intact. When buildings collapsed or burned, catastrophic for the inhabitants, the clay tablets within were often preserved. Fire that destroyed papyrus or parchment actually strengthened clay tablets by firing them more thoroughly. What did they write? Initially, the proto-cuneiform was purely pictographic, simple pictures representing objects and concepts. A sheep meant sheep. A head with a bowl meant eating. These evolved from clay tokens used for accounting, small shaped clay objects representing goods that were pressed into clay to create records before writing emerged. But within a few centuries, cuneiform expanded dramatically. scribes realized that signs could represent not just objects, but sounds, phonetic writing. This allowed them to capture full language, complete with grammar, verb tenses, and complex ideas. By 2500 BCE, cuneiform could express anything that could be spoken. The earliest texts are accounting records, tallies of sheep, measures of grain, assignments of workers. These reveal a sophisticated economy managing resources across cities and temple complexes. We can track trade networks, see taxation systems, understand labor organization. One tablet might list 40 sheep received from the shepherd Enlil Nadine, 35 sheep delivered to the temple of Inanna, 5 sheep given as rations to workers building the canal. But cuneiform quickly expanded beyond accounting. Legal documents recorded contracts, sales, marriages, adoptions. The Code of Hammurabi, inscribed on a stone stele around 1750 BCE, contains 282 laws covering everything from property rights to criminal punishment. Reading these laws, we understand Babylonian society's values and concerns. Literary texts include the Epic of Gilgamesh, one of humanity's oldest stories, written on tablets around 2100 BCE. This epic tale of a king seeking immortality after his friend's death explores themes of mortality, friendship, and human limitation that resonate across millennia. The story exists in multiple versions on different tablets, showing how it evolved and spread across the ancient Near East. Medical texts describe diseases, symptoms, and treatments. Babylonian physicians documented cases, creating a medical literature that was copied and studied for centuries. Mathematical texts show Babylonian astronomers and mathematicians working with sophisticated concepts. They used a base 60 number system that survives in how we measure time and angles today. Personal letters reveal intimate details of ancient lives. Merchants writing to partners about shipments and prices. Families discussing marriages and inheritances. Officials reporting to superiors about administrative matters. One famous letter from a student to his mother complains about not having nice clothes like other students, a complaint that could come from any era. School texts show how scribes learned their craft. Practice tablets where students copied signs repeatedly, learning the hundreds of cuneiform characters. Bilingual word lists where Sumerian words were paired with Akkadian translations. Effectively ancient dictionaries. Mathematical problems worked out step by step. Literary excerpts copied for practice. One remarkable discovery is the library of Ashurbanipal in Nineveh, excavated starting in the 1840s. This royal library from the 7th century BCE contained over 30,000 tablets, covering every aspect of knowledge, literature, science, religion, history, administration. King Ashurbanipal was a bibliophile who collected texts from across his empire, having them copied for his library. This single discovery preserved a significant portion of Mesopotamian literature. The library's organization shows sophisticated archival principles. Tablets were cataloged, sometimes with tags identifying content. Series of tablets making up longer works were numbered. Storage was carefully managed. When archaeologists excavated the library's remains, they could reconstruct its original organization, understanding how ancient librarians thought about knowledge classification. Reading these tablets, we hear Mesopotamian voices directly, unfiltered through later copies or translations. A scribe's colophon at a tablet's end might give his name, date, and occasionally personal notes. Whoever breaks this tablet, may the gods curse his family. Or more prosaically, hand of Nabu-zukupkenu, junior scribe, month 12, day 20. These small human touches connect us across 5 millennia. 3200 BCE, Egyptian hieroglyphs and papyrus. Writing gets portable. Around 3200 BCE, as Mesopotamia developed cuneiform, Egypt created hieroglyphic writing. But Egyptians developed something revolutionary that would change writing forever: papyrus, the first truly portable, flexible writing surface that could be produced in quantity. Papyrus was made from the papyrus plant, Cyperus papyrus, that grew abundantly in the marshes along the Nile River. The plant could grow up to 15 feet tall, with triangular stems topped by feathery umbels. These plants were so important to Egyptian civilization that papyrus became a symbol of Lower Egypt and appears frequently in temple decorations and hieroglyphic writing. The process of making papyrus was intricate and required considerable skill. Papyrus makers, who formed a specialized craft guild, would harvest the mature stems by cutting them near the base. The stems were then transported to workshops where the real work began. First, the outer green rind of the stem was peeled away, revealing the white pith inside. This pith was the key to papyrus. Using sharp knives, workers sliced the pith into thin strips, cutting lengthwise along the stem. The strips needed to be as uniform as possible, ideally paper-thin, but not so thin they would tear. The best papyrus came from strips cut from the center of the stem, which were whiter and finer than outer portions. These strips were laid out on a flat surface, typically a wooden board, side by side vertically. The strips were placed so they slightly overlapped at the edges. Then a second layer of strips was laid horizontally across the first layer, again slightly overlapping. The crossed arrangement created structural integrity. The genius of papyrus lies in what happened next. The strips were pounded or pressed together, sometimes with wooden mallets, sometimes with stone weights, sometimes using mechanical presses in later periods. As the strips were compressed, the plant's natural sugars and starches acted as glue, causing the layers to bond together without any additional adhesive. The pressed sheets were then left to dry, sometimes in the sun, sometimes in the shade, depending on the desired quality. As they dried, the sheets were periodically beaten again to ensure tight bonding and a smooth surface. The result was a flexible, cream-colored sheet that could be written on both sides, though one side was typically smoother than the other. Multiple sheets could be glued together end to end to create long scrolls. The longest surviving papyrus, the Great Harris Papyrus from the reign of Ramesses III, measures over 133 feet long, a massive scroll containing administrative records and temple inventories. Typical scrolls ranged from 10 to 30 feet, rolled around wooden rods for storage and protection. The quality of papyrus varied considerably. The finest papyrus, made from the innermost strips and carefully processed, was smooth, white, and took ink beautifully, reserved for important religious texts, royal decrees, and luxury literary works. Lower grades, made from outer strips or less carefully processed, were rougher and browner, but perfectly adequate for everyday documents and letters. The Egyptians developed at least 6 recognized grades of papyrus, each with different prices and appropriate uses. The pen for writing on papyrus was fundamentally different from the Mesopotamian stylus. Egyptians used a rush stem, typically from the Juncus maritimus plant, cut to a length of about 6 to 10 inches. The end was chewed or cut to create a brush-like tip that would hold ink and release it smoothly onto the papyrus surface. Later, around the late period, Egyptians developed a true reed pen with a split nib, similar to later quill pens. The reed was cut at an angle, and a small slit was cut in the tip to help ink flow. These pens required more skill to make, but produced finer, more controlled lines, essential for the increasingly complex cursive scripts that developed. Ink was another Egyptian innovation. Black ink was made from soot, collected from oil lamps or produced by burning plant materials, mixed with water and gum arabic, a natural adhesive from acacia trees. This mixture was formed into solid cakes or sticks that could be stored indefinitely. To write, the scribe would wet the brush, rub it on the ink cake, and apply it to papyrus. Red ink, used for headings, dates, and special notations, was made from red ochre mixed with the same binder. Scribal kits typically included 2 ink cakes, black and red, housed in a wooden pallet with depressions to hold the cakes, and a slot for storing reed pens. These pallets are among the most common Egyptian artifacts found in tombs and archaeological sites. Writing on papyrus was fundamentally different from pressing marks into clay. It was faster, no waiting for material to dry. It was lighter. A scroll could be carried easily under one arm. It was flexible. Scrolls could be rolled and unrolled without damage. This made papyrus revolutionary for administration, correspondence, and literature. But papyrus had significant vulnerabilities. It was sensitive to moisture. Water would cause the plant fibers to swell, the sheets to separate, and the writing to blur. It was susceptible to insects and mold. It was fragile compared to clay. Tears and holes appeared with rough handling. Papyrus scrolls required careful storage in dry conditions. This is why most surviving papyrus comes from Egypt's desert climate, particularly from tombs and buried storage facilities in regions like the Fayum and Oxyrhynchus. In the dry air, papyrus could survive thousands of years. But in humid climates like Greece, Italy, or the Levant, papyrus deteriorated within decades unless carefully preserved. This creates a bias in our historical knowledge. We know far more about ancient Egypt than about other papyrus-using cultures, because Egypt's climate preserved the evidence. For monumental inscriptions meant to last forever, Egyptians carved hieroglyphs into stone, using copper and later bronze chisels. The process was time-consuming and required specialized craftsmen. Masons would first sketch the design on the stone surface with red ochre. Master carvers would then cut the hieroglyphs either in raised relief, where the background was carved away, leaving the signs raised, or in sunken relief, where the signs themselves were carved into the surface. Sunken relief was particularly common in Egypt because it withstood harsh sunlight better. The carved-in signs created shadows that made them visible even in bright light. The carvings were often painted in brilliant colors: red, blue, yellow, green, black, white, creating stunning polychrome inscriptions. Many temple walls still show traces of these original colors, preserved where they were protected from weathering. These stone inscriptions still cover temple walls throughout Egypt, as clear today as 4,000 years ago, describing Pharaoh's deeds, honoring gods, recording offerings, and rituals. The Rosetta Stone, discovered in 1799, bears the same decree in 3 scripts: hieroglyphic, Demotic Egyptian, and Greek, and became the key to deciphering hieroglyphs after scholars compared the 3 versions. What did Egyptians write on papyrus? An astonishing variety. Administrative records tracked grain shipments, tax collections, worker assignments, and temple inventories. The Wilbur Papyrus, over 30 feet long, lists land holdings and tax assessments along a 90-mile stretch of the Nile, essentially an ancient cadastral survey. Literary works include the Tale of Sinuch, an adventure story of an Egyptian official who flees to Asia, lives in exile among foreign peoples, and eventually returns home. A tale of loyalty, identity, and belonging that remains compelling today. The story of the shipwrecked sailor, the tale of 2 brothers, the instructions of Tahotep. Egyptian literature covered multiple genres, from adventure to wisdom literature to poetry. Medical papyri are particularly valuable. The Edwin Smith Papyrus, dating to around 1600 BCE but copying earlier material, describes 48 surgical cases, including head injuries, broken bones, and wounds. It's remarkably practical and empirical, describing symptoms, diagnosis, and treatment with minimal magical elements, one of the earliest examples of rational medical thinking. The Ebers Papyrus, over 68 feet long, contains 877 prescriptions and remedies for various ailments. While it includes magical spells, it also documents actual treatments, herbs, minerals, and animal products that had genuine therapeutic effects. Modern analysis has shown that several Egyptian remedies had real medical value. Mathematical texts show Egyptian mathematics. The Rind Mathematical Papyrus contains 84 problems covering arithmetic, geometry, and algebra. Practical problems about dividing loaves, calculating areas, and managing resources. Egyptian mathematics, while less abstract than later Greek geometry, was highly practical and effective. Religious texts include the Book of the Dead, not actually a single book, but a collection of spells and instructions meant to guide the deceased through the afterlife. Copies were made to order for wealthy individuals, placed in their tombs to serve as guidebooks for the soul's journey. Each copy was unique, containing different selections of spells based on the deceased's needs and budget. Love poems survived on papyrus, revealing intimate emotions across millennia. "If I kiss her and her lips are open, I am drunk without beer," reads one poem. These verses show Egyptians experienced love, longing, and heartache just as we do, making them feel suddenly human and immediate despite the vast time gulf. Letters preserve personal voices. A soldier writing home asking for supplies. A son writing to his mother about family matters. Business correspondence between merchants. Official dispatches between government officials. One famous letter from a widow to her dead husband, written on papyrus and left at his tomb, complains that he's not protecting her from misfortune and demands he do better. Apparently, Egyptians believed the dead could receive mail. One extraordinary discovery is the Oxyrhynchus papyri, found in an ancient garbage dump in the city of Oxyrhynchus in Upper Egypt. Starting in 1896, archaeologists began recovering papyrus fragments from this site. To date, over 500,000 fragments have been discovered, the vast majority still unpublished and untranslated. Among the Oxyrhynchus finds, lost works of Greek literature, including poems by Sappho, plays by Sophocles, and historical works by Thucydides. Early Christian texts, including gospel fragments dating to the 2nd and 3rd centuries CE, private letters, legal documents, receipts, school exercises, horoscopes, medical prescriptions, the everyday detritus of ancient urban life, preserved in a garbage dump that became one of history's greatest archives. The Oxyrhynchus finds revolutionized our understanding of the ancient world. They showed how Greek and Egyptian cultures mixed in Hellenistic and Roman Egypt. They revealed everyday life, literacy levels, economic transactions, religious practices. They pushed back the dates of Christian texts. They recovered lost literary works, all because papyrus, though fragile, survived in Egypt's dry conditions even when discarded as trash. 1200 BCE, Chinese oracle bones, East Asian writing begins. The earliest confirmed Chinese writing appears around 1200 BCE during the Shang dynasty, inscribed on oracle bones, animal shoulder blades or turtle shells used for divination. The process was ritualistic. Questions about important matters. Will the harvest be good? Should we attack our enemies? Will the king's illness improve? Were carved into the bone using a sharp tool. Heat was then applied, causing the bone to crack. Diviners interpreted the pattern of cracks as answers from ancestors or gods. These bones have survived because bone, like fired clay, is remarkably durable. Thousands have been discovered, providing the earliest examples of Chinese characters. Remarkably, these characters are recognizably ancestral to modern Chinese writing, a continuous tradition spanning over 3,000 years, longer than any other writing system still in use. For everyday writing, the Chinese used bamboo and wooden slips. Bamboo was cut into thin strips, dried and smoothed. Text was written with brushes made from animal hair, rabbit, wolf, or sheep, mounted in bamboo or wood handles. The ink was made from pine soot, mixed with animal glue, and formed into solid ink sticks. To write, the scribe would grind the ink stick with water on a stone to create liquid ink. Writing with a brush created the distinctive flowing style of Chinese calligraphy. Unlike the pressed wedges of cuneiform or the linear scratches on papyrus, brush writing allowed thick and thin strokes, curves, and angles, creating characters that were both functional and artistic. Bamboo books were made by binding many strips together with silk or hemp cord. A complete book might contain hundreds of strips and weigh many pounds. These books were cumbersome but durable. Bamboo doesn't tear like papyrus. However, bamboo is vulnerable to moisture, rot, and insects. Most ancient bamboo books have been lost, surviving only through later copies on paper. Important discoveries of bamboo texts in waterlogged tombs have preserved writings that would otherwise be lost. The tomb of a Chu state official from around 300 BCE contained extensive bamboo books including philosophical texts, divination manuals, and literature. Reading these, we access Chinese thought in its original form, not filtered through later copies. What did they write? Government records formed the bulk. Tax assessments, legal cases, administrative orders, but also philosophy, Confucian classics, Taoist texts, historical chronicles, and literature, including early poetry collections and historical narratives. 600 BCE. Indian palm leaves, tropical writing. In the Indian subcontinent, writing developed using palm leaves as the primary surface. The preparation was elaborate. Leaves from the talipot palm or palmyra palm were cut, boiled to make them supple, dried in the sun, and cut into strips. These strips were then rubbed with turmeric or other substances to protect against insects. The pen wasn't a pen at all, but a stylus, a pointed metal tool that scratched letters into the leaf surface. After inscribing, ink or soot was rubbed over the surface and then wiped off, leaving the dark pigment only in the scratched grooves. This made the text clearly visible against the pale leaf. Multiple leaves were stacked and bound with cord through holes near the edges, creating manuscripts that could be hundreds of pages long. Palm leaf manuscripts required careful storage. They needed protection from humidity, insects, and handling damage. Palm leaves don't last forever. In tropical climates with monsoon rains, a palm leaf manuscript might last 50 to 100 years before deteriorating. This created a tradition of regular copying. Buddhist monasteries and Hindu temples maintained scriptoria where monks and scholars continuously copied texts onto fresh palm leaves before the old ones decayed. This copying tradition preserved vast libraries of literature despite the impermanent medium. Sanskrit literature, Buddhist scriptures, Hindu philosophical texts, medical treatises, astronomical works, all survived through continuous copying across centuries. Some palm leaf manuscripts have survived remarkably intact. In the dry climates of Nepal and Tibet, manuscripts over 1,000 years old still exist. The oldest surviving palm leaf manuscript with a definite date is from the 9th century Nepal, still readable today. What did they write? Religious texts dominated: the Vedas, Upanishads, Buddhist sutras, Jain scriptures, but also literature like the Mahabharata and Ramayana, scientific works on mathematics and astronomy, medical texts on Ayurvedic medicine, and philosophical treatises. One significant discovery is the Nalanda University manuscripts. When this great Buddhist university was destroyed in the 12th century, many manuscripts were carried to Tibet for preservation. These texts, copied on palm leaves, preserved Buddhist teachings that would otherwise have been lost when Buddhism declined in India. 300 BCE, Mediterranean parchment, animal skin as canvas. While papyrus dominated the Mediterranean world, an alternative emerged around 300 BCE in Pergamon, modern Turkey. Parchment made from animal skins. Creating parchment was labor-intensive. Animal hides, sheep, goat, or calf, were soaked in lime water to loosen hair and flesh. The hides were scraped clean, stretched on frames, dried under tension, and scraped again to create a smooth surface. The result was a durable, flexible writing surface that could be written on both sides. The finest parchment, called vellum, was made from calfskin. Its surface was so smooth that scribe could write tiny detailed text. Mistakes could be scraped off with a knife and corrected. Impossible with papyrus. Parchment could be folded and bound into codices, books with pages, rather than rolled into scrolls. Parchment survives remarkably well in moderate climates. Unlike papyrus, it tolerates humidity. Properly stored, parchment can last over 1,000 years. Many medieval manuscripts on parchment remain in excellent condition, their text and illuminations as vivid as when created. The pen for parchment was typically a quill, a large bird feather, usually goose or swan, with the tip cut and split to create a flexible writing point. Quills were dipped in ink, made from oak galls, abnormal plant growths caused by wasp larvae, iron sulfate, and gum arabic. This iron gall ink was dark, permanent, and has survived centuries remarkably well. What did they write? By this period, the classical world was producing extensive literature, Greek philosophical works, Roman legal texts, early Christian scriptures, scientific treatises. The transition from scroll to codex enabled by parchment revolutionized how books were organized and read. Codices could be indexed, referenced, and navigated in ways impossible with scrolls. The Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered in caves near the Dead Sea in the 1940s and 1950s, include both papyrus and parchment documents from around 300 BCE to 100 CE. These preserve some of the oldest known biblical texts, providing direct insight into Judaism and early Christianity. Medieval Europe's great illuminated manuscripts, the Book of Kells, the Lindisfarne Gospels, were created on parchment. The smooth surface allowed intricate decoration, combining text and illustration into masterpieces that were both religious texts and works of art. 105 CE. Paper invented in China. The revolution begins. Around 105 CE, during the Han Dynasty, a Chinese court official named Kai Lun developed what would become history's most important writing surface, paper. The process began with plant materials, tree bark, hemp, rags, fishing nets, anything containing plant fibers. These materials were soaked in water until they broke down into pulp. The pulp was beaten to separate the fibers, creating a suspension in water. This mixture was poured onto a fine screen or mesh. Water drained through, leaving a thin layer of tangled fibers on the screen. This layer was pressed, dried in the sun, and resulted in a sheet of paper. Paper was revolutionary. It was lighter than bamboo, cheaper than silk, easier to produce than parchment, more durable than papyrus in varied climates, and could be made from abundant, renewable materials. A single person could produce many sheets in a day. Books became cheaper, more portable, more abundant. Chinese bureaucracy expanded dramatically with paper. Government records multiplied. The imperial examination system, which selected officials based on written tests, became more elaborate. Literature flourished. Poetry collections, historical chronicles, philosophical works, all became more accessible. Paper technology spread gradually. Korea adopted it by the 6th century, Japan by the 7th century. Each culture refined the techniques. Japanese washi paper, made from mulberry bark, became renowned for its strength and beauty. Korean Hanji paper developed distinctive qualities. The Islamic world acquired papermaking around 751 CE when Chinese papermakers were captured during the Battle of Talas. The technology spread throughout the Islamic Empire to Samarkand, Baghdad, Damascus, Cairo, and eventually Islamic Spain. Islamic scholars embraced paper enthusiastically, using it for the enormous scholarly output of the Islamic Golden Age. Paper reached Europe through Islamic Spain around the 11th century. Europeans initially distrusted it, preferring parchment for important documents. But paper's advantages, cost, availability, ease of production, eventually won over. By the 13th century, paper mills operated throughout Italy, France, and Germany. Water-powered mills mechanized production. European papermakers developed watermarks, designs pressed into wet paper, to identify manufacturers. They refined sizing treatments that made paper less absorbent, better for writing. What has survived on paper? Everything. The vast majority of historical documents from the past 1,000 years exist on paper. Chinese poetry and philosophy, Islamic scientific treatises, European literature and correspondence, administrative records, legal documents, newspapers, books. Paper became humanity's primary medium for preserving thought. The oldest surviving paper documents are Chinese texts from the 2nd century CE. European medieval manuscripts on paper from the 13th and 14th centuries survive in libraries worldwide. Paper's abundance meant multiple copies of texts existed, increasing the chances that at least some would survive. The Printing Revolution, 1450s and beyond. Paper enabled printing to become practical, but it was Johannes Gutenberg's development of movable type printing in the 1450s that created one of history's most transformative technologies. The combination of paper and printing didn't just make books cheaper. It fundamentally restructured how information flowed through society, who had access to knowledge, and how ideas spread. Before Gutenberg, books in Europe were copied by hand, primarily by monks in monastery scriptoria. A single Bible might take a scribe a year or more to complete. Books were so valuable, they were chained to desks in libraries to prevent theft. Literacy remained largely the province of clergy and nobility because books were simply too expensive and rare for most people to access. Gutenberg's innovation was movable type, individual metal letters that could be arranged to form words, locked into a frame, printed, then broken apart and rearranged for the next page. The concept had existed in China since the 11th century, but Gutenberg's execution was uniquely suited to European alphabetic writing and achieved unprecedented practical success. The process of creating movable type was sophisticated metallurgy. Each letter had to be cast in metal, a lead-tin antimony alloy that was hard enough to withstand repeated pressing but soft enough to cast cleanly. Gutenberg developed a hand mold that could cast letters with remarkable consistency. Each E or A needed to be exactly the same height and width as every other one, or the printing would be uneven. A complete font required hundreds or thousands of individual pieces, not just the 26 letters of the alphabet, but uppercase and lowercase versions, multiple sizes, punctuation marks, ligatures, combinations of letters that commonly appeared together. A printer's shop might have 100,000 or more individual pieces of type, organized in cases with compartments for each character. Compositors, skilled workers who set type, would read from a manuscript and select letters from the cases, arranging them backward and upside down in a composing stick. Once a line was complete, it was transferred to a galley. When a full page was composed, the type was locked into an iron frame called a chase. This locked frame was then placed on the printing press. The printing press itself was adapted from wine and olive presses common throughout Europe. A large wooden screw mechanism provided downward pressure. The composed type was inked using leather balls daubed with oil-based ink, another of Gutenberg's innovations, as water-based inks didn't work well with metal type. A sheet of paper was laid on the inked type. The press was operated to squeeze the paper against the type with enormous pressure, and the printed sheet emerged. A skilled printer could produce about 250 sheets per day, far faster than any scribe. And once the type was set, additional copies cost almost nothing beyond paper and ink. The economics of book production shifted dramatically. The first print run of a book was expensive, but subsequent copies were cheap. Printing on parchment would have been prohibitively expensive. Each page required an animal hide. Paper made printed books economically viable. Early printers used paper almost exclusively, reserving parchment only for special presentation copies for wealthy patrons. Gutenberg's first major work, completed around 1455, was a Bible. The famous Gutenberg Bible, or 42-line Bible, so called because each page had 42 lines of text. About 180 copies were printed, of which 49 survive today. These Bibles were large, impressive works, printed on high-quality paper or vellum, with spaces left for illuminated initials to be added by hand, maintaining some of the luxury manuscript tradition while using the new technology. But the true revolution was in what came next. Printing spread rapidly throughout Europe. By 1500, just 50 years after Gutenberg, there were printing presses in over 200 European cities. An estimated 15 to 20 million books had been printed, more books than had been produced in all of European history before that point. The types of books printed reflected and shaped society's transformation. Religious texts dominated initially: Bibles, prayer books, books of hours. The Catholic Church was one of the largest customers for early printers. But this flood of religious texts had unintended consequences. When Martin Luther posted his 95 Theses in 1517, criticizing Catholic Church practices, printed copies spread across Germany within weeks, reaching the rest of Europe within months. This would have been impossible with manuscript copying. Luther wrote prolifically, and printers eagerly published his works. They sold well. Between 1518 and 1525, Luther published more than 1,800 works in over 390 editions, totaling about 300,000 copies. No medieval author could have reached such an audience. The Protestant Reformation was enabled by printing. Luther's ideas spread faster than the Church could suppress them. Printed Bibles in vernacular languages, German, English, French, allowed people to read scripture themselves rather than relying on clergy interpretation. This challenged fundamental church authority. The printing press had become an engine of religious revolution. The invention of newspapers and periodicals created entirely new forms of information distribution. The first newspapers appeared in the early 17th century in Germany. These newsbooks published weekly or monthly, carrying information about wars, politics, trade, and unusual events. By the late 17th century, newspapers published regularly in major European cities. Newspapers transformed how people understood the world. Before newspapers, most people knew only what happened in their immediate vicinity and what travelers might report. Newspapers brought distant events into local consciousness. A merchant in London could read about wars in Germany, trade opportunities in Asia, political developments in France. This created, for the first time, a sense of participating in events beyond one's immediate surroundings. The periodical press also created public opinion as a force in politics. When people across a country read the same news, discuss the same issues, they formed collective views. Governments had to consider public opinion in ways previously unnecessary. This shift from purely elite politics to a broader public sphere was enabled by print. Advertising emerged as a distinct practice with printing. Before printing, advertising was largely oral. Town criers announcing sales, merchants shouting about their wares. Printed advertisements could be posted on walls, distributed as handbills, or placed in newspapers. By the 18th century, newspapers devoted significant space to advertisements, creating a revenue model that subsidized news gathering. Early advertisements were simple: announcements of goods for sale, services available, properties to let. But advertisers quickly learned techniques of persuasion. Woodcut illustrations made advertisements eye-catching. Clever slogans and verse made them memorable. Testimonials provided social proof. The art of advertising developed alongside print, learning to capture attention and drive action through printed words and images. Propaganda became a science with printing. Political factions could distribute pamphlets presenting their views, attacking opponents, rallying supporters. During the English Civil War in the 1640s, both royalists and parliamentarians printed numerous pamphlets, creating a battle of words alongside the military conflict. During the American Revolution, pamphlets like Thomas Paine's Common Sense shaped public opinion decisively. 500,000 copies circulated in a country of 2.5 million people. Governments recognized print's power and sought to control it. Licensing systems required printers to obtain permission before publishing. Censorship laws prohibited certain content. Sedition laws criminalized criticism of government. Yet controlling the press proved difficult. Clandestine printing operations produced forbidden materials, smuggled across borders, or distributed secretly. Scientific communication was revolutionized by printing. Before printing, scientific knowledge spread slowly through hand-copied manuscripts and personal correspondence. Printing enabled scientific journals where researchers could publish discoveries quickly, reaching wide audiences. The first scientific journals appeared in the 1660s. The Journal des Sçavans in France and the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society in England. These journals allowed scientists to establish priority for discoveries, build on each other's work, and replicate experiments. A scientist in Italy could read about an experiment performed in England, replicate it, and publish results, creating an international community of inquiry. The scientific revolution and the Enlightenment were enabled by print's ability to spread ideas rapidly among educated elites. Education was transformed by printing. Before printing, education relied on oral instruction and limited manuscript texts. Students listened to lectures and memorized content. Printed textbooks made standardized education possible. A school could purchase textbooks for students, ensuring everyone studied the same material. Teachers could assign readings. Students could study independently. Literacy rates climbed as books became affordable. In 1450, perhaps 10% of Europeans could read. By 1800, in some regions, literacy exceeded 50%. This wasn't solely due to printing, but printing made universal literacy imaginable and achievable. Books for teaching reading proliferated: primers, ABCS, simple texts designed for beginners. Literature evolved with printing. Novels emerged as a literary form enabled by printing's economics. A manuscript novel represented enormous labor for a single copy. A printed novel could reach thousands. Authors could make livings from writing, creating a professional author class. Literary culture shifted from aristocratic patronage to market economics. Authors wrote what readers would buy. Publishers printed what would sell. The bestseller was invented with printing. Certain books achieved massive circulation: religious works, popular novels, practical manuals. John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, published in 1678, sold over 100,000 copies in its first decade. Extraordinary for the time. Such wide circulation was simply impossible before printing. Popular culture was democratized. Broadsides, single sheets with songs, ballads, news, or stories could be bought cheaply by ordinary people. Chapbooks, small, cheaply printed booklets, brought literature to the masses. These weren't high culture, but popular entertainment, purchased by servants, laborers, farmers, people who could afford a few pence for reading material. The standardization of language was accelerated by printing. When texts circulated in manuscript, regional variations in spelling and grammar persisted. Printing encouraged standardization. Publishers developed house styles. Dictionaries codified correct spelling. Grammar books prescribed proper usage. National languages were increasingly standardized, replacing or suppressing local dialects and languages. This had political implications. Standardized national languages helped create national identities. A person in northern Germany and southern Germany, previously speaking mutually unintelligible dialects, could read the same printed German. This created linguistic communities that coincided with political aspirations for national unification. The business of printing created new economic structures. Printers, publishers, booksellers, paper makers, ink makers, type founders. Entire industries emerged around print. Copyright concepts developed to protect authors and publishers. Book fairs like the Frankfurt Book Fair became major commercial events where publishers bought and sold printing rights. The power dynamics of knowledge shifted fundamentally. Knowledge was no longer concentrated in monastery libraries and royal courts. Anyone who could read and afford books could access knowledge previously available only to elites. This didn't immediately create social equality. Education and literacy remained unevenly distributed, but it created possibilities for social mobility through self-education that hadn't previously existed. Print also created information overload, a concern that sounds remarkably modern. Scholars complained about too many books being published, inability to keep up with new knowledge, declining quality as publishers printed anything that might sell. These anxieties about information abundance appeared within a century of printing's invention, suggesting that information overload is not unique to the digital age, but rather a recurring response to technological change in information distribution. By the 19th century, steam-powered printing presses industrialized book production further. Rotary presses could print thousands of pages per hour. Mechanized papermaking produced paper cheaply in enormous quantities. These developments created the mass media age. Daily newspapers with huge circulations, popular magazines, cheap novels, mass-market books. The telegraph and later the telephone created real-time news gathering. Newspapers could print events that had occurred the same day, creating an immediacy impossible in earlier eras. Photography added visual immediacy. Newspapers could show readers what distant events looked like, not just describe them in words. Yet through all this technological evolution, the fundamental innovation remained Gutenberg's movable type and the printing press. That technology, refined and scaled but essentially unchanged in principle, dominated information distribution for 5 centuries until computers and the internet created the next great revolution in how humans record and share knowledge. Modern writing, the digital transition. Today, we're experiencing another fundamental shift. For 5,000 years, writing meant making physical marks on physical surfaces. Now, increasingly, we type on keyboards and touchscreens, creating digital text that exists as patterns of electrical charges in computer memory. The average person today types more than they write by hand. Emails, text messages, documents, social media posts, most are typed. Handwriting is becoming a specialized skill, taught in schools but used less in daily life. Yet there's something profound about the physical act of writing by hand. When you grip a pen and form letters on paper, you're doing exactly what Egyptian scribes did 5,000 years ago, what Chinese scholars did with brushes, 3,000 years ago, what medieval monks did with quills, 1,000 years ago. The motion is the same, the hand moving deliberately, forming shapes that carry meaning. The tactile feedback of pen on paper, the slight resistance, the sound of the nib moving. These sensory experiences connect us directly to countless generations of writers. When you write by hand, you slow down. Each letter requires intention. You feel the words forming, not just intellectually, but physically. There's a different relationship between thought and expression when writing rather than typing. Many writers still draft by hand, finding that the slower pace allows different kinds of thinking. Handwriting is personal in ways typing isn't. Your handwriting is unique to you. Your letter formations, spacing, pressure, rhythm. Forensic analysts can identify writers from their handwriting. Loved ones recognize each other's handwriting instantly. a handwritten note carries presence and personality that typed text lacks. Calligraphy keeps alive the artistic tradition of writing. In Islamic cultures, Arabic calligraphy remains a revered art form, with master calligraphers achieving fame. Chinese and Japanese calligraphy are meditative practices where the act of writing becomes a spiritual discipline. Western calligraphy has seen a revival, with hand-lettered invitations and signs valued for their human touch. There's resistance to writing's digitalization. Fountain pen enthusiasts collect and use pens worth thousands of dollars. Journals and notebooks remain popular despite digital alternatives. Bullet journaling, hand lettering, and analog planning systems thrive in our digital age. Perhaps this resistance recognizes something essential. Writing by hand is embodied thought. It engages hand, eye, and mind in a loop of creation. It produces artifacts, letters, journals, manuscripts that carry traces of their makers. Digital text is endlessly copyable, identical in every instance. Handwriting is unique, irreproducible, human. Conclusion. From ochre on cave walls to stylus on clay, from brush on bamboo to quill on parchment, from pen on paper to fingers on screens, writing has evolved continuously across 30,000 years. Each transition brought new possibilities and new losses. Each medium shaped what could be expressed and what would survive. Today, we have more words preserved than ever before. Yet we're more aware than ever of how fragile digital preservation can be. Clay tablets from 5,000 years ago remain readable. Will today's digital files be readable in even 50 years as formats and hardware become obsolete? Perhaps what matters most isn't the medium, but the impulse, the human need to make marks that mean something, to externalize thought, to speak across time and space. That impulse drove our ancestors to paint in caves and drives us to post on social media. The tools change, but the desire to communicate, to preserve, to be heard remains fundamentally human. Thank you for watching.